All right, good evening, everyone. My name is David Park, and tonight I'm going to be giving a presentation on the basics of the film camera. And so what this presentation is going to be covering is the information that you need, that if a film camera were to be placed right next to you, you would be able to pick it up by the end of this presentation and start using it, taking pictures, full-fledged photographer, amateur photographer, right away. And so why learn to shoot film? Why is this relevant? Um, as you guys know, we live in an age, especially with COVID and technology, where we're always kind of being pushed to the next thing. And even especially with COVID, with everything, our whole world, school, work, all these things compressed online, everything can feel like just a long list of digital tasks to do. And we're always kind of having a forward mindset. You know, it's hard to pause in our days. It's hard to look back even and just reflect. And so film photography, this world, enables and it invites you guys to engage in recollection, sentimentality, and time travel. And the reason why I say these things is just as we recollect, right, we engage in the moment, we're kind of like taken back. Our bodies, our minds, our senses are taken back to the moments, these little moments that we had that we are reminded of through these pictures. And what that allows us to do is just pause, is to slow down, and to just see the entirety of our lives and not just the next thing, or whatever is stressing us out at the moment. And so this presentation is just an invitation to all of you guys to engage in this. So a brief history on film photography. The film camera as we know it today was first introduced through something called the Kodak #1. Yes, the same Kodak, the big film company, in 1888. And from this camera is actually where the whole culture and this conception of amateur photography came out of. And this progressed eventually all the way into the 1960s and 70s, where it was just wildly popular because digital photography was not there. But it exploded in the 60s and 70s because as the film camera, the snapshot super quick camera, became available to the general public, families started going crazy, trying to garner all of these cameras because they wanted to capture weddings, birthdays, births, Thanksgiving dinners, New Year's, all these crazy big family events, these monumental events, because they wanted to, again, like we touched on earlier, look back, pause, remember, and just be reminded of like what happened in the past and who we are in connection to the past. But film actually almost the whole industry got completely, it almost became obsolete because of the rise of digital photography in the early 2000s. And so a lot of people thought that it was going to die out. But what happened was in 2017, it returned. And in 2020, we're riding off of that. That's why all of these cameras are so expensive these days. Because essentially what happened in 2017 was these young artists, 20s and 30s, freelance wedding photographers, event photographers, they wanted to just become more known, more independent. They wanted to use film photography as their own signature, to differentiate themselves from their other competitors. And so they wanted to use this aesthetic to get ahead of the other competitors in the market of photography. And so we have three types of film that you can put into a film camera. You have color negative, you have black and white, and then you have color slide. And the only difference between color negative and color slide is just the fact that the color slide has a much smaller room for error. And so it's often referred to as professional film. And so it's like, I don't touch it. It's a very difficult film to use. But they both, color negative and color slide, both have to do with color film. And then black and white, self-explanatory, it's also just black and white film. As you guys see here, it's a famous picture after World War II ended in Times Square. And so, but within this world of color negative film or color film, you have something called expired film. And basically it's when film is processed beyond its expiration date. And these actually are a couple pictures that I took, but, and I didn't know they were gonna turn out like this, but it's super sick. Basically it turns out where it creates these combinations of different pictures. It can create like gradients in your picture. It can create streaks, like different colored streaks that you never know what it's going to look like, but it may add a little bit of a kick, a new uniqueness, a new touch to your film. And so, of course, if you want to know how to take a picture, you have to know just the very basics of composition. We're not going to get into a very deep dive, but essentially composition or the exposure, how your image looks, is based on three things: f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO. The f-stop or the aperture is essentially the amount of light that is transmitted or allowed to hit the film. And that is determined, as you guys can see here in the picture on the right of the exposure triangle on the bottom, how big that opening is. And the bigger the opening, more light is allowed to come in. Shutter speed is the amount of time that light is allowed to enter the camera, right? And so the shutter speed, the shutter is this action where you guys hear the click and the camera goes this. And it basically, the shutter speed determines how fast is that close. And so how much light is being allowed in at a certain amount of time. And so normally with things, when you're trying to capture moving objects, you want this to be quick so that it's not blurry. And finally, ISO is essentially how sensitive is the film to light in general, like as the film chemically. And so this is already determined based on which one you buy. In general, it's best to use 400 ISO film because it's applicable in many different situations. Any deviation is more so for specializations. And so all these three things are summed up in something called the exposure triangle. And so the summary of the exposure triangle is essentially they all exist in a reciprocal relationship, where if you intensify one, you should decrease the others in order to compensate the amount of light. Because if you allow too much light, let's say you set it at a low shutter speed, so this is closing slowly, the ISO is super high, so it's super sensitive to light, and the aperture is super low, which means that the diameter is actually very big, you're gonna have an overexposed film and you're not gonna be able to see because it's so bright. And then vice versa, if everything is too low, then you're not gonna be able to see because the picture will be too dark. And so it's just a balancing act that is learned over time. There's actually no such thing as the perfect exposure, as you guys can see here in the bottom. The picture on the left, it represents the ISO, this kind of fuzziness to film photography. The middle is it's a perfectly balanced, the perfectly exposed film where you can see everything clearly because of the balancing of the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And on the right is what happens when it's an underexposed, so you cannot see really what's happening in that film. And finally, guys, actually taking the shot. This is the fun part. The first step, right, is to pull the film advance lever, as you can see, if you guys can follow along on the right with the camera anatomy. The film advance lever on the top right, you pull it to the right until you hear a click. It's gonna sound like a gun cocking. And then you pull the camera up to you and you're gonna hold it to your eyes, the viewfinder. And the viewfinder is right under this horseshoe in the top middle. And basically what you're going to do is look through it, see what image you want to capture. Based on how much light you see, you then adjust the exposure using the shutter speed dial right next to the film advance lever, and the focus ring and the aperture ring, which are on the actual lens. And so the focus ring is on the top. You can focus it based on how you want the subject to look. And then you use the aperture ring to do, like we talked about earlier, how much light do you want to let in. And finally, when you determine that exposure, just hold it up to your eye, again, the viewfinder, and you press the shutter release button here, also near the film speed dial. And you want to do it you want to do it while you're holding the camera as steady as you can, so you get a clear image. And just final reminders, guys, about film photography. If this sounds like too much commitment, there are always disposable cameras by Kodak, Fujifilm that are much cheaper, much easier to use. You just hold it to your eyes at the viewfinder and you click and the image is there. And also, if you do use a film camera, no such thing as the perfect shot. So go out there, have fun. Doesn't matter eventually how it looks, because it's all about the moments. It's all about remembering and just remembering our identity, our story. Thank you, guys.